with technology and rockets alone. It's built on the dreams, risk, and relentless spirit of those who dare look up and say, "We belong there." For over 30 years, the Space Frontier Foundation has been a home for these visionary, radical, action-oriented individuals. Hear their stories, learn how space was shaped, and revel in the revolution of commercial space pioneers. Welcome again to Commercial Space Pioneers, joined today by the man, the myth, the legend, Gary Hudson. And Gary, right off the bat, I got to tell you, my first experience of learning about you as I kind of got into this industry was that centerpiece of Mojave Air and Spaceport that prominently sits there and welcomes everyone in. And I absolutely love it because it is the thing that welcomes people in, but it also is a thing that tells people that space is hard.
Indeed. And I like to give credit where credit is due there, because Rotown wouldn't have happened without my longtime business partner, Bevan McKinney's input. Was really his conception. I was simply the vessel that tried to make it happen.
We'll talk, Mojave and all the cool stuff that's happened there over the years. We'll get there. And I'm not going to ask for your bona fides up front. Mm-hmm. If you're watching this, you already know that we're only talking to the people that have been the real people in it and doing it. My question is, I want to go back as you were growing up, either adolescent or earlier. What was space when you were a kid that kind of laid the foundation of how you viewed this whole idea of people going into space?
Sure. Well, my wife and I like to say it was all Walt's fault. When people say, Walt, and I said, yes, Walt Disney. Back in 1955, when I was 5 years old, there was a Disney television program in black and white, because color had not yet been invented for TV as yet. 3-episode Sunday evening program called Men into Space. As an impressionable 5-year-old, I bought the comic. I watched the program religiously. I never saw it again until I turned 50 in the year 2000. But I now have it on DVD and watched it with equal enjoyment the second time around. And it showed Von Braun and Stuhlinger and that crew talking about how you would do human spaceflight. And it left a very deep impression on me. It caused me to go to the local library and live among the stacks and read books by Willy Ley and the Collier's series with Bonestell and Freeman's illustrations and so forth. And this just really implanted the vision of a space age in an impressionable young person's mind.
Help us understand a little bit, because there's a few of us that have not accumulated as much experience as you have. Mm-hmm. If this was, you said 1955?
55, right.
Okay. 5 years old, 1955. Good. I can follow that one. This is not the right stuff. This is not big videos of rockets launching. This is before any of that.
Yes. This is in the V2 to Viking to the original Viking, not the Mars lander, to not yet Vanguard. Not yet Sputnik, not yet Jupiter C Explorer.
Okay. So you're hooked even pre-Sputnik. There you go. All right. So did this become on your list of things as a kid, if you're starting out as a 5-year-old, and 5-year-olds are notorious for getting deep into a thing and then the next week it's something else. Right. So you went literally deep into the stacks.
And never came out.
Never came out.
Right.
So I guess asking what your passion was before you found that episode is going to be tough, but so you've really been all in on space since you were 5.
Yes. Yeah. And I don't recall any passion prior to that time. The passion's never left. I mean, this is what I do. It's the external locus of my existence is moving humankind into space.
Well, there's not a better place to talk about it than right here. So, all right. So, what, as you're watching, you're growing up and forming, mental capacities as the early American space program, as you're seeing the competition with Russia and the US, do you have any recollection of how, pre-Apollo, as you're following it, what was your sense of that? Was it a conflict? Was it a competition?
Yeah, good question. Well, I mean, it was clearly a little bit of both. The Cold War was in full swing. When I went to school, we did duck and cover because of the threat of nuclear war. Only a few years later, the Cuban Missile Crisis happened. That was, I guess, 62 when I was 12. We used to watch, we all clustered around black and white television at my grade school when John Glenn was launched and when Alan Shepard was launched and Gus Grissom was launched and so forth. It was very much part of the American culture at the time. I wrote my first book report on Villy Lay's illustrated books about space when I think it was 7. I read Arthur Clarke's Profiles of the Future. It made a deep impression on me. I got to meet Arthur 10 years later and we became friends. It set me on this particular path, and I pretty much never wavered from that path. Though there is a slight detour I took in my late teens.
As you are a teenager, space is going from science fiction and prognostication to real.
Right.
To me, that sounds like that's a huge step. Did it feel like that was a huge, or did that just seem like it was the natural evolution and that's what should happen?
It was totally natural. It was like there was never a question whether it was faith or intellect or whatever that put me on this path. As I say, I've never wavered, and I always expected things to happen much, 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 much faster than they in fact happened.
The moon race is on as you are trying to figure out what to study. Did you go high school to college, or what was as you're trying to figure out how to turn this into something, was there a training for space or was it something else?
So I was a ridiculously accomplished student from kindergarten through end of high school in 68, which I did all at the same school. Okay. St. Bernard's parochial school, a Catholic parochial school in St. Paul, Minnesota. So I was a very good student. I recall the only problem I ever had in school. I was probably the archetypical nerd, but the only problem I ever had was my chemistry teacher gave me a chemistry set to take home. And I flunked a test in spelling, and she threatened to take away my chemistry set if I didn't improve on spelling. So I did get very much better than that, but was close to a 4.0 student, won the leadership award for the school, acted in plays and had a reasonably calm childhood and growing up. But I never thought that education was the key to my ambition.
Okay.
It's like, I already know what I'm going to do. Yeah, I have to learn a few things along the way, but it wasn't to get credentials.
Okay.
To go to work for Boeing or Douglas or something like that.
That's an important distinction right there. Because there's credentialism, which is like, oh, I need these things as badges to get me in, and you were seeing education as things like elements you had to get, but it wasn't really relevant to the direct thing. And do you have any idea of what the concept was? Okay, so space is a big thing. As you were in your high school years, what was it that you knew you were going to be doing something in space, but did it have any more flavor or color than that?
It formed sometime in the 60s. I couldn't tell you exactly when, but I think there were two components to it. One is I wanted to see a true science fiction like future emerge, where you lived in space, lived and worked in space permanently. Yeah, I saw it as a high frontier, an endless frontier that, sort of manifest destiny, humankind
Okay.
going to the stars type of thing. So that was the goal. The role that I wanted to play, I think, solidified probably around 1968 or so, 69, when I read Frontiers in Space by Bono and Gatland. They talked about the problem of space transportation. So that's when I began to focus on the real question of space transportation. I actually communicated with and visited both of the authors, Phil Bono at Douglas, or at that time McDonnell Douglas Corporation in Huntington Beach, who was notable for his concepts of single-stage to orbit and fully reusable launch vehicles, and Ken Gatlin, who was he headed the British Interplanetary Society. In 1964, I was a volunteer at the Science Museum of Minnesota, and a speaker from the BIS came by and gave a Saturday afternoon lecture and talked me into joining. And so I'd actually been a fellow of the British Interplanetary Society since the late 60s. As I said, I visited with Gatland, and that is what actually led me to Arthur Clarke, because on that, I think I was 20 or 21, perhaps 22. I was in London talking to Gatland, and he said, well, you should talk to Val Cleaver, who had an engine development at Rolls-Royce. And I told Val Cleaver what I wanted to do, which was build the Phoenix single-stage to orbit, fully reusable launch vehicle. And Cleaver, we were having lunch near Piccadilly Circus, and he said to me, you can no more do that than levitate yourself over Piccadilly Circus in this instant. He said, and I have a friend who will explain that to you. Do you know who Arthur Clarke is? And I said, yes. And he said, well, I'll set up a meeting. And so the next day I had a meeting with Clarke, who was visiting from Ceylon, Sri Lanka, now at his club, at Arts Theatre Club in London. And we talked for hours about my ambitions. But it illustrates one thing. I was never afraid to knock on the door of great people. When I was 18, Jim Webb, then retired head of NASA, came to town, and I went up, knocked on his hotel room door, and he spent an afternoon talking to me about space systems management. I'm 18 years old, and he spent that time. Managed to spend a little bit of time with Ed White, the astronaut who did the first U.S. spacewalk. I think that would have been in 65 or so. And he, of course, he died a couple of years later in the Apollo 204 fire. So I figured I would learn by osmosis by talking to great men who had accomplished great things, and a little bit of that would rub off on me along the way. I was an arrogant, young pup to think that I could do that, but these guys were kind enough to, not kick me to the curb and actually have a decent conversation with me and teach me things.
And how did you manage? Like, you're in Minnesota.
Yes.
How are you showing up in London and California, and like, are you? Yeah, are you just hopping on a Greyhound, or like what?
No.
How does that happen?
It's a two-part story. Well, I grew up not poor and not rich. My father was sort of self-made man. He had a small business. It was himself, his mother, and me during summers. He was basically a wholesaler of grocery products and such, sufficient that we had a comfortable middle-class existence. Also, through high school, I participated in science fair projects, and I won things like trips to Washington, D.C., trips to San Diego, representing the state of Minnesota as some sort of exceptional student. I got to do a little bit of travel that way. And then in the 70s, I actually made my living as a public speaker. For the entire period of the 70s, I made my living as a public speaker on the subject of space, and specifically commercial space things. IBM was one of my largest customers, and they would pay me ridiculous amounts of money to go on the lecture circuit for them, to talk to their management classes. So I'd get like $2,000 to plus travel expenses to go places. It means I didn't have a job. I mean, that was my job, and it was like 3 days a month. So I had, I mean, it was just this miraculous opportunity to spend time and learn, rather than sort of waste time in college. I did attend college, but in a couple of graduate programs at the University of Minnesota in physics and medicine, but dropped out because I simply couldn't pursue the agenda that I wanted to pursue. Again, it's that, arrogance of youth that it's like, did I really do those things?
But I mean, that has come full circle. You have Peter Thiel like trying to encourage people to not to drop out of school to do his experimental thing. So you were doing that before it was cool.
I was the archetype before it was an archetype.
Yeah. So, all right. Wow. So you're not kidding. You're really carrying and deep into this space world. You're talking to a lot of people that are both on like engineering solution side, but also communication,
right?
The sci-fi sort of thing. So you've stitched a bunch of these different things together. Was there a particular point here where you had a change of vision about what this was going to be? And the reason I'm asking that is, at what point did you come across Gerard K. O'Neill, like in terms of his ideas?
Yeah. So, well, let me actually go back 10 years before I met Jerry. I think it was probably 1970, first time I had been to the UK. I got together with a science fiction writer. I've been fortunate to number a lot of science fiction writers of so-called hard science fiction, the golden age, as friends and acquaintances. But this fellow, James Blish, wrote a series of books called the Cities in Flight series, which was basically taking it from kind of present day, late 60s, early 70s type environment to the far future. One of the visions of one of the early characters in that book began to encapsulate my vision of the future, which was he was dreaming of an immortal man who flew to the stars faster than light. When people would say to me, "What is your ambition?" It's to fly the stars and live forever is the elevator. I'll slip to another anecdote. This is what old men do: is we tell anecdotes now. Right? So the next anecdote was when I met with Arthur Clarke the first time in London. One point in the conversation, he asked me something like, what's your long-term ambition? And I said, there's a phrase in a chapter of your book, Profiles of the Future, called Space the Unconquerable, where he talks about the limitation of the speed of light. And the last sentence of that chapter, no man will ever turn homeward at 26 light years distance. No man will ever turn homeward from beyond Vega to greet those he knew and loved on Earth, because that's about the limitation of a human lifetime. And I said my ambition was to prove him wrong. and Arthur, he looked at me for I'm 22, right? And he looked at me and he said, perhaps you shall. So instead of saying, you stupid git, I was just making money writing a book. He actually was encouraging, and that was profound for me. Anyway, so I spent the rest of the 70s thinking about the problem of space transportation, designing what were admittedly naive solutions to that problem, looked at nuclear propulsion, all this sort of thing.
You're saying naive. When did you realize that what you were doing then was considered naive? Is that you today calling them naive?
Yeah. I mean, there were elements of the designs that would have worked, but every time, I mean, there's a reason why an aircraft designer, who maintains a library of their designs and notebooks or whatever, goes through in their lifetime 300 or 400 designs. Burt Rutan, was at model 350 or something when I think he retired. So it's because we sketch things out, right? Yeah. There's a book called The Engineering Through the Mind's Eye that talks about the eye-hand connection that kind of bypasses the brain. It's an intuitive design process of, you doodle and sketch, and that's how you come up with innovation. But these things are fairly complicated. A launch vehicle, a reusable launch vehicle is pretty darn complicated, as you know. You're going to make mistakes along the way, and you're not going to recognize that they're mistakes until you actually, this is why rapid prototyping is important. You can build it, you break it. This is principal contribution in my mind of SpaceX to the world, is that Elon had enough of his own money, as versus the rest of us who had to go out and try and raise money, to do many iterations of rapid prototyping and not care when he crashed, 10 first stages or something. Anyway, going to when I met Jerry, I had gotten to the point of saying, well, reusables are going to be too hard. You're not going to be able to find the money to do it. There was, the shuttle program was in full bloom at that time. And in fact, I had gotten together with von Braun to talk about reusable launch vehicles. This was, I think, 72, and I even asked him, to join the board of directors of a company that I wanted to start. And he said, if you build payloads for the shuttle, I will do it. But if you try and compete with the shuttle, I can't do it, because, Senator Mondale will use it to kill the shuttle program. Say, well, there's a commercial path to doing this, and we can't afford the shuttle program to be killed. And later, my mentor, Max Hunter, said to me the story about, which I think von Braun told to him at one point, was when you are in a rowboat with an elephant crossing a swiftly moving stream, you rock when he rocks, and you think about changing the arrangement when you get to the other side. and the shuttle was the elephant in the boat at that time, not the elephant in the room so much.
So, but hold on. I know you're heading to the thing that I asked you about.
Yeah,
I gotta stop. I gotta ask, when he tells you this, and he states it flatly, that like, okay, great, I'm on board, love to help you if it complements
shuttle,
the program of record.
Right.
What did you think? Like, do you recall?
I turned it down.
Okay.
I mean, I was an arrogant bastard. I turned von Braun down. I mean, he was a gracious, gentleman who was offering to do me a favor, and because I was a stupid young punk, I turned him down.
Did you believe, like, was that concept of needing to be part of this larger machine, that, like, did you just dismiss that, or were you like?
Yeah, it was anathema to me. It was like, okay, I know better. I mean, all young people think they know better than their elders. It's, that's been the case since, Samaria and so yeah, I was just a punk kid at the time.
Yeah, but you did it. Punk or not, you blew off Werner von Braun. It seems like now you really appreciate that wisdom that he imparted to you. Mm-hmm. Any idea between when he said it and now, when did you go, oh, all right, that actually might be important or right? Or
in the 80s, but I actually designed what I believe to be the first phased array geostationary small sat kind of like what Astronomist is doing now, specifically for the shuttle bay. Because at the time, the pricing on the shuttle bay was not weight lifted to orbit, it was length. Okay. So NASA had this, I don't know if it was an arbitrary criteria or what that's allowed them to settle on it. But if you could make very thin spacecraft that slotted into the keel and trunnion fittings of the shuttle, you could fly for some ridiculous low amount of money, like $8 million a flight or something like that. So I designed this 15-foot diameter, 2-foot thick spacecraft. The solar wings folded up on it. It had a phased array instead of a shaped antenna, and all the propellant was in the body, and it could raise itself to geostationary orbit from the shuttle bay, offer a couple of transponders worth at a time. So I realized that when you look from the ground to geostationary orbit, a slot looks only like 2 degrees wide. So you could co-locate a dozen spacecraft in that slot, because that's like 30 kilometers or 50 kilometers worth of arc length, right? So you just maneuver the spacecraft around a central point, and from the ground, an antenna thinks it's one spacecraft. So you didn't have to, put up 24 transponders at a time or 50 transponders at a time to make money. Anyway,
okay. So you eventually did come to appreciate that, but that is important, because that is a truth of the space world, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, and when does it but it's important to understand that space doesn't happen in a vacuum. Terrible. But that political reality, and that was, you said, in the early 70s.
Yeah, that was, I think, 72.
So this is not like the shuttle's been flying and impacts on the market then. This is still
at the beginning of the shuttle program.
Yeah, we have just about our last Apollo mission, right? Anyway, okay.
Well, actually, the last Apollo mission was flown that month, and it was the only one I actually managed to attend. I got a VIP invitation to Apollo 17. But anyway, to go back to your O'Neill,
and the O'Neill concept as much as the person, right? Because
so the concept, he was doing this with his students at Princeton in the very early 70s, and so I followed it with a great deal of interest. My concern was getting stuff into orbit, and he was basing it on the shuttle, and I knew that the shuttle was never going to be $10 million a flight for 65,000 pounds.
Did you throw something at him? Did you now? I feel like we're gearing up for you kicked him in the shins. But all right, please go.
Sort of. It was a friendly kick.
Okay.
So what I did is I was also transitioning away from full reusability at the time to expendable commercial launch vehicles as sort of an initial step to generate enough revenue to get to full reusability. So I came up with a concept that used F1 engines in recovery capsules that was modular. So it was basically at that time, companies like Otrag were looking at, sort of an asparagus stalk type vehicle with lots of, super dumb pressure fed engines and so on. I said, well, I'd like to do this with an engine that was no longer in production, but was on the cusp of just having gone out of production, so you could potentially get them. I designed this thing up. I don't know that I even gave it a name, but it was a bunch of, I think they were 12 or 15-foot diameter, sort of Falcon size. If you imagine a bunch of Falcon first stages, some of them wrapped around a core or 3 in a line. And it would put fairly significant payloads, sort of Falcon Heavy class payloads into orbit. And I thought it could do it quite cheaply. So I sent that to O'Neill, and his interest was basically, it costs way too much money to develop a new launch vehicle, so we have to stick with shuttle. So I didn't have a lot of content. This was very late 70s, 78 or more. So Space Studies Institute had just been stood up by him at that time. And he was mainly pushing satellite solar power as the economic incentive to drive space, what he called colonization, what I like to call settlement at the time. So I pivoted even further to a purely expendable vehicle called Percheron that became the US's first private commercial launch vehicle attempt, which I crashed and burned in Texas in 1981, but did manage to seek and find a modicum of private funding to get developed. And it put me in very much direct engagement with NASA. The NASA general counsel at the time said, well, we have regulatory authority over all spaceflight, which there's nothing in the Space Act of 1958 as amended that gave them that permission. But this is where the whole FAA-AST, what was originally the Office of Commercial Space Transportation, established by an act of Congress in '84, flowed out of. So I was directly responsible for creating that act, not in a good way, but it was in response to the fact that I used a loophole in the FAA code, which said that unmanned rockets, you had to file one piece of paper to launch an unmanned rocket. One piece of paper. And it cost, like $1,000 in attorney's fees to file that. And we got our permission to fly that vehicle. Of course, we blew it up in an engine test, but setting that aside, what happened was my partners, my investor partners, became Space Services Inc. That ultimately became the Conestoga 1 and Conestoga 2 and so forth. But circling back to O'Neill, it was only about 10 years later that Jerry and I and Tanya and my wife Ann found ourselves at a governor's conference in Hawaii on commercial space activities. At the time, Hawaii was talking about a commercial space launch site on the Big Island, which never, of course, went anywhere. But we spent a week together on the Big Island and talked through his ideas for a commercial GPS triad. Would have replaced the current GPS, because GPS was not available to the public during the 80s. And so we got to be pretty friendly at that time. And previously, I'd also been quite friendly with Ted Taylor and Freeman Dyson from Orion days. I knew them during the 70s, during my short excursion into looking at nuclear pulse propulsion as a way to build planetary spaceships, solar system spaceships, as Max Hunter used to call them. So when Jerry regrettably passed away from cancer in the early 70s and Freeman took over, we had some chats about Space Studies Institute, but it kind of became moribund for a long time until Freeman asked me in I think it was like 2010 to take over from him, because he was trying to divest himself from assignments that he couldn't adequately follow.
So if folks are not familiar right off, Space Studies Institute was founded by Gerard O'Neill. Similar focus, and there are so many space organizations that a lot of them share an awful lot of similar roots and similar connections, and sometimes it's the exact same people that you will see where in this group and in that group, and so the Space Frontier Foundation also very connected to the O'Neillian future vision.
Yes,
but as you're talking about your solution set, right? You're going through, you're iterating, you're saying, okay, single stage, okay, maybe partially reusable, okay, expendable. Mm-hmm. What is your expectation of space? How is that evolving? What are the inflection points that drove your iteration? Was there some revelation of, oh crap, I've been going down the wrong path, or like?
Yeah, so I think the revelation was and continues to be money. I mean, how much money can you raise? And I think you can do an expendable for considerably less than a reusable, depending on the technologies that are available. And data comes not well, it comes in a continuous stream to you if you were doing what I was doing during the 70s, which is going to conferences, talking to people, it was a time ITAR didn't exist, right? International Traffic in Arms regulations and limitations on publishing papers and so on. I mean, we talked about everything. I mean, I talked critical nuclear weapons design information with people. I mean, there was literally no. It may have been nominally verboten to do, but nobody paid any attention to it. So I remember once talking to some senior, I mean, we're talking vice presidential level type people at McDonnell Douglas, saying to me, I really need to understand how the Delta II first stage is put together, and they sent me the blueprints. Okay, I mean, I had the entire suite of blueprints for Delta II, including all the manufacturing information. One.
And out of curiosity, why would they just isn't that proprietary information, or were they worried about you?
No, I mean, and they knew what I was interested in.
Yeah.
Building alternative. It was a completely different time.
Why do you think that is?
Well, because there was no commercial IP, intellectual property consideration really being applied. Government contracts get kind of handed out. Well, Convair got one last year, so this year it's going to go to Douglas, right, to level set the industry, so that one company never had a leg up on another company. And it's only when that system kind of got out of control and companies like Rocketdyne and Rockwell got thrown really massive contracts that you started to see this forced consolidation of the industry, and now things got tighter and tighter. And then, of course, with the Clinton China stuff in the late 90s, ITAR got clamped down on all of us, and we've all got our ITAR stories. But it was a completely open environment. I mean, go out to an AIAA conference. How many papers are submitted by SpaceX?
I don't.
None.
Really?
I mean, there are, I think I've found 3 or 4 SpaceX papers.
Okay.
In the last 15 years.
Okay.
All right. They don't share. Okay. And they use the excuse of ITAR, but it's clearly a proprietary trade secret type thing. So the industry, in many respects, stagnates because of that. This lack of. It was a very freewheeling conversation. I could walk into NASA headquarters in the early 80s, no security, no nothing, go down into the library, spend my
back to the stacks
hours back in the stacks, between meetings, like I'd have, these. I remember I mentioned that attending the Apollo 17 launch, I was standing next to a vice president of Chrysler Corporation with my camera. Right next to the VAB, because there was about a 3-hour delay because of a vent problem on the Saturn third stage. And we got to talking, and he asked me what I did, and I explained I was a designer of single-stage to orbit reusable launch vehicles. He said, we got a big contract for the shuttle Phase B activity for Chrysler Serve, which was a single-stage non-expendable reusable launch vehicle that Charles Therrett and his team put together. And I said, I've never seen that report. He said, I'll send it to you. So I fly back home to Minnesota, and a couple of days later, UPS delivers a crate, right? And it's the entire SERV report, multi-million-dollar report, microfiche as well as hard copy, which I still have, just no questions asked. I mean, I still refer to that report and things.
And
it's staggering.
Yeah, and especially my lived experience is tremendous amount of competition within companies,
Yes.
And there still is there's a lot of maybe people are all following a similar trend, but there is, benchmarking against your competition and things like that. And it's a zero sum,
Very much
there's
so.
only so much work to go around.
Right.
But that's really phenomenal. So as you're getting huge volumes of this stuff, and by the way, when you did your launch and NASA got upset about it, did they call you up on the phone and say, "Hey, this is NASA," and you yeah, funny, did they show up at your door with a padlock, or what? How did NASA show up to say, "Hey, space is our domain, get out of here"?
Well, my attorney at the time, who also facilitated the investment, which came from David Hanna and his friends in Houston in the oil and gas business, Art Dula, who was Houston-based, he actually sent, I'm pretty sure he sent a letter to Neil Hosenball, the NASA general counsel at the time, who made this claim to us in a letter and basically said, bugger off. This, it's, you have no authority here. And they shut up on that. But of course, what's going to happen is the Houston community is very close knit with NASA. And at the time, NASA was very hostile to commercial space. Very, very hostile. I mean, it's a complete 180 flip these days, of course, but it took 4 decades for that to happen, or at least 3 decades for that to happen. And so the space services guys asked for NASA JSC to not investigate, but to do an assessment of, what about our design and all this. And my design, frankly, was crappy. It was what I could afford to do on $1.4 million. I mean, it was depressingly poor engineering at the time, but it's all I could do. And they sent a fellow, Henry Pohl, who, to his credit, wrote a report back saying, well, they made a few mistakes here and there, but if they fixed those things, they would have had a chance to make it work. And he actually said that to the press, and it was published in the local papers. So, but Deke Slayton got involved in this, and he was one of the astronauts I never knew. I knew probably 30 or 40 of them. So he managed to convince David Hanna and crew that they wanted to transition to solid fuel because it was simpler and more reliable. Well, I knew one thing for certain in my life, which is solid fuel rockets were never going to be cheaper than a liquid system. And they, of course, had no role to play in reusability, as we've evidenced from the shuttle activity, right? That's when space services pivoted to solids, and they even offered me a job at a ridiculous, I think they offered me $75,000 to be head of research or something like that. And at that time I was 30 and not a 20-year-old punk, but I still turned them down because I didn't see a future for that. And that's when I sort of pivoted back to various Phoenix designs, which ultimately led to the DCX program and the flights of DCX.
So we had, there's another conversation with Jess Sponable and several other people that were around DCX. What's your path to this first, DCX still, I think, counts as the first rocket that landed, right?
Yes, correct.
Powered landing.
Yeah, powered landing.
Going up is easy, coming down is even easier. It's the landing part, the soft landing, that's really hard.
Yeah. So what happened there was in the mid-70s, I got a fairly close working relationship with Max Hunter, who was at Lockheed and had worked on Hubble Space Telescope, but before that was principally a launch vehicle guy. He was chief engineer on third stage of Saturn V, the Lockheed Space Shuttle plants and so forth. And so Max essentially became my mentor unofficially. We just worked together for years. And then when he retired from Lockheed, or as he was retiring, he spent a lot of time with me. His version of my Phoenix was called SSX, or Spaceship Experimental. So he was a big fan of bringing back X-planes to which NASA had abandoned, sort of after the 60s because of budget limitations. So he and I together kind of did he from the Lockheed point of view, me from the, just me going out and being a rabble rouser, did this multi-court press to get the government interested in reusable launch vehicles. I mean, this basically now post-Challenger. And a big role was also played by Danny Graham's High Frontier organization and by Jerry Pournelle's Citizens Council for National Space Policy, Citizens Advisory Council for National Space Policy, which the Reagan administration asked him to form as an ad hoc group. We had like 8 meetings between 1980 and 1988, the last of which, I was always presenting Phoenix, and I was always being shot down by most of the conventional aerospace guys at the time, until the last meeting when it was adopted as the output of the council to advise them to move ahead. And we had Aerospace Corporation actually write a report. It was kind of an interesting report that J. Penn and Charles, they wrote a report. Aerospace management forced them to water it down, but even watered down, it was called the Phoenix :SSX report, and they essentially said it was worth doing. Now, the Bush White House, with Dan Quayle as head of the National Space Council, to approve the program, and it went forward because of that. So that is the genesis of DCX. And it's I have 2 professional honors in my misfit career. One is, of course, the Space Frontier Foundation's Kind Founders Award to me in 2007, but the other is, along with Jeff Spotable, Jerry Pournelle, Max Hunter, Pete Worden, I was on the Aviation Week and Space Technology Laurel Award for 1994 for DCX.
All right. I'm going to ask a somewhat crass question. How are you paying your bills while you're doing all these great things for the betterment of society? Like, as you are, you seem to be constantly right there, pushing the boundary, sometimes, kicking important people down the stairs or whatever. But so as you're doing that, like, were you still speaking and
you can thank IBM. Throughout the 80s, they kept me going in very hard times by paying me for public lecturing. I stopped doing that about the time of DCX, where I was on 2 of the teams. Max was on the McDonnell Douglas team. I was on the Boeing team under Dana Andrews, and also on the General Dynamics team.
Okay. And out of curiosity, when you're out there, so you're talking to people that are at an IBM, like, these are not rocket people at IBM,
no,
right?
Software managers typically.
Okay. So what are you telling them about? Or is this like, hey, here's someone who's going to give you an inspirational? Were you the?
I was the after dinner speaker.
Okay.
They would have these week-long management classes, and on Thursday night they would hold, a banquet type thing, and I was the after dinner speaker, talking about technology in general, but with a focus on space. And it turns out, surprisingly, I was a pretty popular speaker, and it got me. I mean, it brought me, for example, to Unispace in 1982, which was a UN conference in Vienna. So I gave a lecture in Brussels, and then for IBM, and then flew to Vienna on a cheap flight. I have a very brief anecdote of meeting Arthur Clarke again at that time. We'd only been corresponding by letter, of course. There was no such thing as email. And I'm standing, I have no credentials to attend this United Nations conference. The doors are guarded by guys in some machine guns and so forth. And I'm standing there, and Jerry Gray of the AIAA, who didn't much care for me because I was a rabble rouser, walks by with his credentials and looks at me and says, "What are you doing here? You have no business being here." And I said, "I'm just hanging out." And at that instant in time, like the Almighty has, just, decided to, the clouds parted and the light ray came down and touched me. Arthur walks up and says, "Gary," and comes up and embraces me and says, "Come on in. I'm ambassador extraordinary and plenipotentiary from Sri Lanka." He takes me by the hand and drags me into this conference where I spent the rest of the day. And Jerry's face was priceless at that moment in time. Anyway, so that's how I got around and did things. I certainly didn't make any money from the rocket business until Boeing and GDE started, hiring me to do stuff. And then after DCX, Bob Citron of SpaceHab and Walt Kistler, who was one of the funders of SpaceHab originally, Walt wanted to do a reusable. He called the K0 and then the K1, and he engaged at that time AMROC, my competition in the expendable launch business that Bevan McKinney was one of the founders of, had gone out of business after the death of George Koopman and the loss of their Set 1 vehicle at Vandenberg, which I think was 89 or thereabouts. So we had never met. We had just been competitors. We got together one day at a restaurant, and we were born within 10 days of each other in the same year. We had exactly the same trajectory, the same college dropout, the whole story of our life. I mean, it was like we were mirror images. So we decided to go into business. We created a company called HMX for Hudson McKinney Experimental to be kind of the scaled composites of the rocket business. Okay. And went up to Seattle to talk to Kistler when they started Kistler Aerospace, and ended up with the contract to do the propulsion systems for the K0 one afternoon. It was like a $1.4 million contract, and it just fell into our laps. That's what put us on the trajectory that ultimately ended it with Bevan and I and a rotary rocket, and then subsequently, the Rascal program with DARPA, the air launch program, T-Space, and all that of the 2000s.
There is, in case anyone who is watching this isn't aware, there is so much to unpack just in the section of things that you've already talked about, much less all of the things you have done since. But
we're out of time.
We're going to save that. We'll have to have like another. We should have our own series just talking to you. Tell me if you can, like, as you think about that period, up until the 2000s, there's a lot of activity and a lot of grinding and shifting of what the perception of space is going to be as it goes, literally from science fiction to reality. And then some of that stuff that Von Braun was talking about, like the political realities of it. How do you recall your trajectory across that in terms of where was your thinking changing, and when were you inspired, and when were you depressed, and like what were the things, are there any demarks where you can think of, I knew what I was going to do, but I hit a wall and I wasn't sure?
So the wall has always been financing. At one point, Jerry Pournelle introduced me to a friend of his, Tom Clancy, the author. Yep. And Tom and I, this was in the very early 90s, Tom and I spent a fair amount of time trying to raise money privately for a reusable launch vehicle. We failed. He was very apologetic about that. He tried very hard. I spent a lot of time with him at his house on Chesapeake Bay, which is, for those of you who are Clancy fans, an exact copy of Jack Ryan's house in Patriot Games. Tom later became an investor in Rotary.
Yeah,
I think I saw a beginning of the shift of the political sands. Even during the 90s, NASA was largely hostile to any sort of commercial space. They were starting to accept reusable launch alternatives as they took over DCX, and then the abortive and badly managed X-33 program happened. At the time of Rotary, of course, there was Kelly Space and Technology, there was Kistler, there was Pioneer rocket plane, and Lori Garver and her crew actually at that point became much more involved in getting NASA to try and engage with these commercial firms. So they offered us money. Our lead investor at Rotary did not want to take any government financing at all, and so we ended up turning it down. But they were offering us like $7 million or something. And then there was sort of this post-internet stock bubble collapse that happened in the early 2000s. And at that time, I went to my whiteboard and I drew a Venn diagram, two Venn diagram circles, which are the intersection of the sets of the interests of investors and the interests of customers. And the intersection is like this. There's practically none.
Yeah.
Because investors are interested in, a quick exit strategy, at 10 times multiple on their money. And so customers just want problems solved, and they're willing to pay for that. So that was when I decided to be like Willie Horton and the bank robber. Why do you rob banks? It's because where the money is. I pivoted to government financing, and we did programs, the Alt Access program for NASA, which was sort of the first idea of like the COTS program of carrying commercial cargo to the space station, working with DARPA. And that's where I learned how to do other transaction authority activity, which is basically like Space Act agreements that NASA wasn't using, teach NASA how to do Space Act agreements, which led to the COTS program. And it led to T-Space winning the CE&R, concept exploration and refinement program that the White House put into place after Columbia in '73, all of which sort of paved the road cleared the minefield, as it were, for SpaceX. Yeah, there's a certain degree of I'm bitter.
You helped loosen the lid, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And you're not alone.
Yes.
But you're right. Yeah, there's a tremendous amount of work in pushing the whole industry forward to get to the point where such a thing could exist. All of us who have worked in the industry have an eternal debt of gratitude to you for that constant shoulder to the wheel over decades and decades to help make today's space world exist. Because you can't just sit around and be like, okay, I want it to happen. You sit on the couch, it doesn't change. You got to get up and do stuff.
Well, I also want to give acknowledgement to my longtime close friend and colleague of 50 years, Tom Brose, whose illustrations made it possible for me to convey my vision to the world, and of course to Bevan for 30 years of exceptional engineering on his part.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I greatly appreciate it. No one should have any doubt that you are absolutely one of the great commercial space pioneers. So thank you very much, Gary Hudson.
Thanks. I hope to come back sometime and talk about the 2000s. Take care.